For 40 years, I swallowed silence. Then one night, I saw my model elder husband kissing another elder in our driveway. Hidden magazines, whispered calls, a hotel receipt, and a letter signed DC. When I spoke up, they threatened to erase me. Today, I'll expose how faith became a weapon and who shook behind pulpit. My name is Eleanor, and I am 73 years old. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here, speaking these words aloud, I would have called them a liar possessed by demons. But here I am, in my small apartment in Cedar Falls, telling a story that I kept buried in my heart for over 4 decades. A story about faith twisted into control, about love corrupted by hypocrisy, and about how the very people who claim to speak for God can be the ones who betray Him most completely. I was born in 1951, the daughter of devoted Jehovah's Witnesses who believed with every fiber of their being that they had found the one true path to salvation. My childhood was structured around meetings 3 times a week, door-to-door preaching every Saturday morning, and endless hours studying the publications of the Watchtower Society. We didn't celebrate birthdays or Christmas, didn't salute the flag, and certainly didn't question the wisdom of the governing body in Brooklyn. My parents raised me to be the perfect witness wife, submissive, quiet, and completely devoted to the organization's teachings. When I was 22, I married Thomas Mitchell, a rising star in our congregation who seemed destined for great things in God's organization. Thomas was handsome, articulate, and possessed a commanding presence that made everyone sit up and pay attention when he spoke from the platform. The elders praised his knowledge of Scripture, his dedication to the preaching, work, and his natural leadership abilities. Within 5 years of our marriage, he had been appointed as a ministerial servant, and by the time I turned 30, he had become one of the youngest elders in our circuit. I felt blessed to be his wife, proud to support such a spiritually minded man. Our home became a gathering place for other elders and their families, and I took pride in preparing elaborate meals and maintaining a spotless house that reflected well on Thomas's position. I threw myself into the role of the exemplary elder's wife, pioneering in the preaching work, conducting Bible studies with interested women, and always appearing perfectly groomed and spiritually uplifting at every meeting and assembly. But marriage, as I quickly learned, is like living in a house with someone. You see them when they think nobody is watching. You observe their private moments, their unguarded expressions, their true character when the public mask comes off. And what I began to see in Thomas troubled me deeply, though I pushed those concerns aside for years, telling myself that I was being overly suspicious or that Satan was trying to plant doubts in my mind about my spiritually appointed husband. The first sign that something was wrong came just 2 years into our marriage. I had come home early from a meeting because I was feeling ill, and I found Thomas in our bedroom hastily shoving something under the mattress. When I asked what it was, he became defensive and angry, telling me that a wife should trust her husband and not ask prying questions. Later, when he was out preaching, I looked under the mattress and found magazines that made my stomach turn. They contained images of men in compromising positions, the kind of material that our organization condemned as pornography and spiritual poison. When I confronted Thomas about what I had found, he broke down crying, saying that he was struggling with impure thoughts and that Satan was attacking him because of his position in the congregation. He begged me not to tell anyone, explaining that it would ruin his reputation and his ability to serve Jehovah effectively. He promised that he would overcome this weakness through prayer and study, and like the obedient wife I had been trained to be, I agreed to keep his secret. I even helped him dispose of the magazines, believing that I was protecting both our marriage and the reputation of God's organization. But the magazines were just the beginning. Over the months that followed, I began to notice other disturbing patterns in Thomas's behavior. He would disappear for hours at a time, claiming he was making shepherding calls on troubled brothers in the congregation. But when I mentioned these visits to other elders' wives, They seemed surprised and said their husbands hadn't mentioned any such arrangements. He began receiving phone calls late at night that he would take in private, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly whenever I entered the room. Most troubling of all was the change in his demeanor toward me. The loving, attentive husband I had married became distant and cold, treating our intimate moments as obligations to be endured rather than expressions of love. He began making cruel comments about my appearance, my cooking, my spiritual activities, as if he was trying to push me away or make me feel worthless. When I tried to discuss these changes with him, he would accuse me of being rebellious and prideful, reminding me that the Bible commanded wives to be in subjection to their husbands in all things. The breaking point came on a humid evening in August 1987. Thomas had told me he was attending an elders' meeting that was expected to run late, so I shouldn't wait up for him. But around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of his car in our driveway. Looking out the bedroom window, I saw him sitting in the driver's seat, not alone, but with another man. They were sitting very close together, and in the dim light from our porch, I could see that they were embracing in a way that no two Christian brothers ever should. My heart pounded as I watched my husband of 15 years kissing another man, with a passion I hadn't seen him show toward anyone in years. The man with him was someone I recognized, Brother Daniel Crawford, a married elder from a neighboring congregation who was often praised for his powerful public talks and his exemplary family life. Here he was, in my driveway at midnight, sharing intimate moments with my husband while their wives slept at home, trusting and unaware. I stood at that window for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching my entire world crumble before my eyes. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my husband, about the spiritual men I had been taught to respect and obey, was revealed to be a lie. When Thomas finally came inside, I pretended to be asleep, but I lay there the rest of the night with my eyes wide open, trying to process what I had witnessed and wondering what I should do with this devastating knowledge. The days following that terrible night were filled with a suffocating mixture of denial, anger, and desperate hope that somehow I had misunderstood what I had seen. I found myself studying Thomas's face at the breakfast table, searching for signs of remorse or guilt, but he seemed completely unchanged. He read the morning text from the Watchtower publication as he did every day, offered a brief prayer for Jehovah's blessing on our activities, and left for work with a kiss on my cheek that felt like a betrayal of everything sacred. I threw myself into my daily routine with renewed intensity, as if keeping busy could somehow erase the images burned into my memory. I increased my hours in the door-to-door preaching work, volunteered for additional cleaning assignments at the Kingdom Hall, and spent long hours preparing for my Bible studies with interested women in the community. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on spiritual activities, my mind kept returning to that moment in the driveway, replaying every detail with painful clarity. The worst part was seeing Brother Crawford at the meetings. He would sit with his wife Martha and their 3 young children, looking like the picture-perfect witness family. During the ministry school, he would deliver powerful talks about Christian morality and the importance of maintaining clean conduct in God's sight. The congregation would nod approvingly at his words, and I would feel physically sick knowing what I knew about his secret life with my husband. When Martha would confide in me about how blessed she felt to have such a spiritually strong husband, I had to excuse myself to the ladies' room to keep from screaming or crying. Thomas's behavior became increasingly erratic as the weeks passed. He would disappear for entire afternoons, claiming he was making return visits on people who had shown interest in our Bible literature. But when I asked him about these visits, his stories were vague and inconsistent. He couldn't remember the names of the people he claimed to be visiting, couldn't provide specific details about their supposed spiritual progress, and would become irritated when I asked follow-up questions about his witnessing activities. The phone calls continued, always, late at night and always taken in private. I began paying closer attention to these conversations, and what I could overhear made my blood run cold. The tone was intimate and personal, nothing like the formal conversations Thomas normally had with other brothers in the congregation. I heard whispered arrangements for meetings, references to locations I didn't recognize, and once, most disturbingly, what sounded like endearments that no married man should be saying to anyone other than his wife. My health began to deteriorate under the stress of carrying this terrible secret. I developed chronic headaches, lost weight, and found myself unable to sleep through the night. Other sisters in the congregation began commenting on my appearance, asking if I was feeling well, and offering to help with my household responsibilities. Their kindness only made me feel worse, knowing that I was living a lie while they continued to view Thomas and me as an exemplary couple worthy of respect and emulation. The breaking point came during a circuit assembly in the fall of that year. Thomas had been selected to give one of the main talks, a discourse on the importance of moral purity and the dangers of allowing Satan to corrupt our thinking through immoral entertainment and associations. I sat in the audience with hundreds of other witnesses, watching my husband stand at the podium, speaking eloquently about the need to maintain clean conduct in all aspects of our lives. As Thomas spoke about the devastating consequences of sexual immorality and the importance of confessing sins to the elders, I felt something break inside me. Here was a man who was living a double life of the most profound kind, preaching about standards he was flagrantly violating in secret, receiving applause and admiration from people who trusted him to guide them spiritually. The hypocrisy was so overwhelming that I had to leave the auditorium and find a quiet place to compose myself before I completely broke down in front of the entire circuit. That evening, after we returned home from the assembly, I finally found the courage to confront Thomas directly about what I had witnessed. I told him that I had seen him with Brother Crawford in our driveway, that I knew about their relationship, and that I could no longer pretend ignorance about his secret life. I expected him to deny everything, to accuse me of having an overactive imagination or being influenced by Satan's lies. Instead, Thomas became completely silent for several long minutes, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and calculating in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. He told me that what I thought I had seen was simply two brothers having a private conversation about congregation matters, and that my suspicious mind was evidence of a spiritual problem that I needed to address through prayer and increased study of the Watchtower publications. But then his tone changed, becoming more menacing as he reminded me of my position as his wife and my obligation to support him in his role as an elder. He explained that spreading rumors or gossip about appointed men could result in serious consequences, including disfellowshipping and the loss of my relationship with Jehovah and the organization. He painted a picture of what my life would be, like if I were expelled from the congregation, cut off from all my friends and the only community I had ever known, branded as an apostate and avoided by faithful witnesses. The conversation continued for hours, with Thomas alternately denying my accusations and threatening me with spiritual and social consequences if I persisted in what he called my delusional suspicions. By the time we went to bed that night, I felt completely defeated and confused. Had I really seen what I thought I had seen? Was my mind playing tricks on me, as Thomas suggested? The seeds of doubt he had planted began to grow, and I started questioning my own perceptions and memories. But deep in my heart, I knew the truth. I had seen my husband kissing another man with passion and intimacy that no amount of spiritual explanation could justify. The question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge, and whether I had the strength to face the consequences of acting on it. The weight of that decision pressed down on me like a physical burden, making each day a struggle just to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my world continued to crumble beneath my feet. I hope you're still with me, listening to this old woman's story. I know it's not easy to hear these things, especially if you've been part of a religious community yourself. But sometimes the most important stories are the hardest ones to tell, and the hardest ones to hear. If my words are reaching you right now, wherever you are, I want you to know that you're not alone in questioning, in doubting, in feeling like something isn't quite right with what you've been taught. Please, leave me a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. Are you in a small town like I was, or a big city? Have you ever felt like you were carrying a secret too heavy to bear? Your words matter to me, and they might matter to someone else who needs to hear that they're not crazy, they're not alone, and they're not wrong to trust their own eyes and their own heart. Don't forget to subscribe if this story is touching something in your soul, because there's so much more I need to tell you, and I need to know that someone out there is listening. The months that followed my confrontation with Thomas were perhaps the darkest period of my entire life. I found myself living in a constant state of hypervigilance, watching his every move, analyzing his every word, looking for evidence to either confirm or deny what I knew in my heart to be true. The Thomas who came home to me each evening seemed like a complete stranger wearing my husband's face, going through the motions of our married life while his real self existed somewhere else entirely, in a shadow world I was forbidden to acknowledge or discuss. My isolation during this period was complete and suffocating. The Jehovah's Witness organization teaches that a wife should bring her concerns about her husband to the elders only in the most extreme circumstances, and that a good Christian woman finds ways to win her husband over through her quiet and submissive conduct rather than through confrontation or accusations. I had been raised to believe that questioning the spiritual qualifications of an appointed elder was tantamount to questioning Jehovah himself, and that good witnesses always gave their spiritual leaders the benefit of the doubt rather than entertaining suspicious thoughts about their private conduct. But the evidence of Thomas's double life continued to mount in ways that became impossible for me to ignore or rationalize away. I began finding small but telling signs of his secret activities throughout our home. There were unexplained absences that didn't match his claimed schedule of spiritual activities, phone numbers written on scraps of paper and quickly discarded when he thought I wasn't looking, and changes in his personal grooming habits that suggested he was trying to make himself attractive to someone other than his wife. The most damaging discovery came when I was doing laundry and found a hotel receipt in the pocket of his suit jacket. The date corresponded to an evening when he had told me he was attending an elders' meeting that was expected to run very late. So late that it would be better for him to stay overnight at Brother Peterson's house rather than make the long drive home in the dark. But the hotel receipt told a different story entirely. He had rented a room at the Riverside Inn, a modest establishment about an hour's drive from our home, and according to the receipt, the room had been reserved for 2 occupants. When I confronted Thomas about the hotel receipt, he initially tried to claim that it was left over from a circuit assembly where he had been asked to provide accommodation for a visiting speaker. But when I pointed out that the date didn't correspond to any assembly or convention on our circuit's schedule, he became angry and defensive, accusing me of going through his personal belongings without permission and violating his privacy as the head of our household. He snatched the receipt from my hands and tore it into small pieces, saying that a faithful wife would trust her husband's word rather than allowing Satan to plant seeds of doubt and suspicion in her mind. But the damage was done. I now had concrete evidence that Thomas was lying to me about his whereabouts and his activities, and the pattern of deception was becoming too consistent to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. I began to pay closer attention to his behavior at Kingdom Hall meetings and assemblies, watching how he interacted with other brothers in the congregation, looking for signs of the relationships I now suspected were consuming his secret life. What I observed during those painful months was a masterclass in deception and manipulation. Thomas had cultivated an image of himself as the model Jehovah's Witness elder, always perfectly groomed and dressed, always ready with an encouraging word or a helpful scripture for any brother or sister who approached him with spiritual concerns. He volunteered for the most challenging service assignments, gave some of the most well-researched and compelling talks from the platform, and was frequently praised by the circuit overseer for his dedication and spiritual maturity. But I also began to notice subtle interactions that took on new and disturbing meaning in light of what I knew about his secret life. There were private conversations with certain brothers that would end abruptly when other people approached. Meaningful glances exchanged across the kingdom hall during meetings, and what appeared to be coded messages passed through seemingly innocent discussions about spiritual matters. Most troubling of all was the way Thomas would find excuses to spend time alone with particular brothers, always under the guise of spiritual shepherding or organizational business, but always with a level of secrecy and exclusivity that seemed inappropriate for legitimate congregation activities. The psychological toll of living with this knowledge while being unable to share it with anyone was devastating to my mental and physical health. I developed chronic insomnia, often lying awake for hours each night, replaying conversations and analyzing behaviors, trying to make sense of a situation that seemed to defy everything I had been taught about Christian marriage and spiritual leadership. I lost significant weight because eating became difficult when my stomach was constantly churned with anxiety and disgust. My hands would shake during prayers at meals and meetings, and I found myself unable to concentrate during Bible study or while preparing talks for the Theocratic Ministry School. Other sisters in the congregation began to notice my deteriorating condition and would often ask if I was feeling well or if there was anything they could do to help. Their kindness and concern only made my isolation more painful, because I knew that if I told them the truth about what I was experiencing, they would either refuse to believe me or would blame me for not being a better wife to such a respected elder. The Watchtower publications were filled with articles encouraging wives to examine their own conduct when their marriages were struggling, suggesting that a truly submissive and spiritual woman could win over even the most difficult husband. Through patient endurance and exemplary behavior, threw myself into this prescribed solution with desperate intensity, increasing my participation in the door-to-door preaching work to the point where I was spending 40 hours a week in field service, volunteering for every available assignment at the Kingdom Hall, and spending hours each day studying the Bible and Watchtower publications in search of answers to my marital problems. I cooked elaborate meals for Thomas, kept our home in perfect order, and made every effort to be the kind of wife the organization said would naturally inspire respect and love from her husband. But nothing I did seemed to make any difference in Thomas's behavior or in his treatment of me. If anything, my increased spiritual activity seemed to irritate him, as if my devotion to the organization was somehow interfering with his ability to pursue his secret activities without detection. He began making cutting remarks about my fanatical approach to spiritual matters, suggesting that my increased meeting attendance and field service hours were evidence of an unbalanced personality rather than commendable dedication to Jehovah's service. The final confirmation of my worst suspicions came during a district convention in the summer of 1988. Thomas had been assigned to give a major talk on the importance of maintaining moral purity in Christian marriage, a presentation that would be delivered to an audience of several thousand witnesses from throughout our region. I watched him spend weeks preparing for this talk, researching scriptures about faithfulness and commitment, practicing his delivery until every word was perfectly calibrated for maximum impact on his audience. On the morning of his presentation, I sat in the convention auditorium with hundreds of other elders' wives, feeling sick to my stomach as I watched my husband take the platform to speak about subjects he was violating in the most fundamental way possible. He spoke eloquently about the sacred nature of the marriage bond, the importance of exclusive devotion between husband and wife, and the devastating consequences that resulted when married couples allowed outside influences to compromise their commitment to each other and to Jehovah's standards. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and several people approached me afterward to compliment Thomas's powerful presentation and to tell me how blessed I was to have such a spiritually mature and insightful husband. I smiled and thanked them for their kind words, but inside I felt like I was dying. The hypocrisy was so complete and so devastating that I wondered how Thomas could live with himself, how he could stand before thousands of people and preach standards he had no intention of following in his own life. That evening, as we drove home from the convention, Thomas seemed energized and satisfied by the positive response his talk had received. He talked about the comments people had made, the encouraging feedback he had gotten from other elders, and the possibility that his presentation might be selected for inclusion in future circuit assembly programs. I listened to him in silence, marveling at his ability to compartmentalize his behavior so completely that he could genuinely take pride in delivering a talk about marital faithfulness while actively betraying his own marriage vows with multiple partners. It was during this period that I made a discovery that would change everything. While cleaning Thomas's study one afternoon, I accidentally knocked over a stack of books on his desk and several loose papers scattered across the floor. As I gathered them up, I noticed that one of them was a letter written in handwriting I didn't recognize. The letter was addressed to Thomas, but it wasn't signed with a name, only with the initials DC, which I immediately recognized as belonging to Brother Daniel Crawford. The contents of that letter made my hands tremble as I read words that no faithful Jehovah's Witness should ever write to another man, especially not to someone else's husband. The letter spoke of love and longing, of secret meetings and shared moments that were described in terms that left no doubt about the physical nature of their relationship. There were references to specific dates and locations, plans for future encounters, and expressions of devotion that belonged in a romance between a man and woman, not between two married elders who were supposed to be shepherding God's flock, with pure hearts and clean hands. What made the letter even more devastating was its date. It had been written just 3 days after Thomas delivered his powerful talk on moral purity at the district convention, meaning that Brother Crawford had been moved to write these intimate words to my husband immediately after hearing him speak publicly about the importance of faithfulness in marriage. The timing seemed like a deliberate mockery of everything our organization claimed to stand for. A private joke between two men who were living lies so profound that they could perform spiritual leadership roles while actively violating every principle they were supposed to represent. I photocopied the letter before returning it to its original position, and that copy became both my greatest evidence and my heaviest burden. Now I had proof of what I had witnessed, documentation that could not be explained away as misunderstanding or spiritual weakness. But I also knew that possessing such evidence put me in an impossible position within the organizational structure that governed every aspect of our lives as Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization's policies regarding allegations against appointed elders were designed to protect the reputation of the leadership rather than to seek truth or justice. According to Watchtower guidelines, accusations against elders required the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same specific incident, a requirement that was virtually impossible to meet when dealing with secretive behavior that was deliberately hidden from public view. Even if I had been able to present my evidence to the body of elders, I knew that they would be more concerned with protecting the organization's image than with addressing the moral failures of their fellow appointed men. Moreover, as Thomas's wife, I was in an especially vulnerable position. The organization taught that wives who made accusations against their elder husbands were likely to be viewed with suspicion, their motives questioned, their spiritual condition examined for signs of rebellion or disloyalty. I had seen other women who had tried to report problems with their husband's conduct be labeled as contentious troublemakers and eventually disfellowshipped for causing division in the congregation. The prospect of losing not only my marriage, but also my relationship with Jehovah and my standing in the only community I had ever known was terrifying beyond description. For weeks, I carried that letter like a burning coal in my pocket, taking it out to read whenever I was alone, as if somehow the words might change or reveal a different meaning that would make my situation less hopeless. But each reading only confirmed what I already knew. My husband was living a lie so complete that it encompassed every aspect of his public and private life, and I was trapped in that lie with no apparent way to escape without destroying everything I had built my identity around. The psychological pressure of this situation began to manifest in physical symptoms that I could no longer hide from others in the congregation. I developed a nervous tic that caused my left eye to twitch uncontrollably during meetings, and my hands would shake so badly during prayers that I had to clasp them tightly in my lap to avoid drawing attention. My voice would crack when I tried to give comments during the Watchtower study, and I found myself unable to maintain normal conversations with other sisters without becoming emotional and having to excuse myself. Sister Rebecca Martinez, an elder's wife who had been my closest friend in the congregation for over 15 years, began to express serious concern about my deteriorating condition. She would invite me for coffee and gently probe about what might be troubling me, offering to pray with me or to provide whatever support I might need to work through whatever spiritual or personal challenges I was facing. Her kindness and genuine concern made my isolation even more painful, because I knew that if I told her the truth about Thomas, she would either refuse to believe me or would feel obligated to report our conversation to her own elder husband. The breaking point came during a shepherding visit that Thomas conducted with Brother Crawford at the home of a young married couple who were struggling with spiritual doubts. I had accompanied Thomas to this visit, as was customary for elders' wives when counseling included sisters in the congregation. As I sat in the living room of this earnest young couple, listening to my husband and his secret lover counsel them about the importance of trust and faithfulness in Christian marriage, I felt something snap inside my mind. Here were two men who were carrying on an intimate relationship behind their wives' backs, sitting in the home of struggling newlyweds, and offering advice about how to build a marriage based on biblical principles. They spoke eloquently about the need for complete honesty between spouses, about the importance of putting Jehovah's standards above personal desires, and about the beautiful example that Christian marriages should provide to the watching world. The young couple hung on every word, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about how to apply these principles in their own relationship. I watched Thomas and Brother Crawford exchange meaningful glances as they quoted scriptures about marital faithfulness, saw them touch hands briefly when passing Bible literature between them, and listened to them speak with apparent sincerity about subjects they were violating in the most fundamental way possible. The young wife kept looking at me with admiration, clearly viewing Thomas and me as an example of what her own marriage could become with enough spiritual maturity and dedication to Jehovah's principles. When the shepherding visit concluded and we were driving home, I found myself unable to maintain the facade any longer. I told Thomas that I could not continue to participate in these charades, that I would not sit silently while he and Brother Crawford counseled other couples about standards they were secretly violating. I demanded that he either end his relationship with Brother Crawford and confess his sins to the body of elders, or that he step down from his position as an elder and allow me to seek help from the congregation about our marital problems. Thomas's response was swift and brutal. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face me with an expression of cold fury that I had never seen before. He told me that if I ever again made accusations against him or Brother Crawford, he would personally ensure that I was disfellowshipped for slander and apostasy. He reminded me that my word alone would never be sufficient to bring charges against appointed elders, and that any attempt to do so would only result in my own destruction and expulsion from Jehovah's organization. But then his tone shifted from threatening to manipulative, as he began to speak about how much we both had to lose if our situation became public knowledge. He talked about our standing in the congregation, our friendships with other witness families, our hope of surviving, Armageddon and living forever in the paradise earth that Jehovah had promised to his faithful servants. He painted a picture of what would happen to both of us if the truth about his conduct became known, how we would be shunned by everyone we cared about, how our names would become synonymous with scandal and moral failure. By the time we reached home that night, I felt completely trapped and hopeless. I understood that Thomas had no intention of changing his behavior or confessing his sins, and that he was prepared to use the organization's own structure and teachings to silence me and protect himself from exposure. I also understood that my choices were limited to either continuing to live with the knowledge of his betrayal while maintaining the public facade of our exemplary marriage, or risking everything I had ever known and loved by attempting to expose the truth to an organization that was designed to protect men like Thomas rather than to seek justice for women like me. The decision to finally break my silence came in a way I never could have anticipated. It was the spring of 1992, and our congregation was hosting a special visit from the circuit overseer, Brother William Hartwell, a man whose reputation for spiritual discernment and organizational loyalty was legendary throughout our region. The entire congregation had been preparing for weeks, cleaning the Kingdom Hall until it sparkled, rehearsing parts for the special program, and ensuring that every aspect of our spiritual activities would reflect well on our local body of elders. During this important inspection, as the wife of a prominent elder, I was expected to play a visible role in hosting Brother Hartwell and his wife during their week-long visit to our congregation. I prepared elaborate meals, maintained our home in perfect condition for their accommodation, and participated in the numerous meetings and field service arrangements that filled their schedule. Throughout this intensive week of spiritual activity, I watched Thomas perform his role as the exemplary elder with an expertise that both impressed and disgusted me in equal measure. But it was during a private conversation with Sister Dorothy Hartwell that everything began to unravel in ways I could never have foreseen. Sister Hartwell was an experienced circuit overseer's wife who had spent decades traveling from congregation to congregation, observing the internal dynamics of witness communities throughout the country. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect problems and tensions that others might miss, and she had clearly sensed something troubling about the atmosphere in our congregation. We were sitting in my kitchen after a particularly intensive day of field service and meetings, sharing coffee and homemade apple pie while our husbands conducted a private meeting with the other elders in the living room. Sister Hartwell had been making pleasant conversation about our local preaching territory and the spiritual progress of our congregation members. But suddenly her tone became more serious and direct as she leaned forward and looked directly into my eyes. "Eleanor," she said quietly, using my first name in a way that immediately commanded my attention. "I've been doing this work with my husband for over 20 years, and I've learned to recognize when something isn't quite right in a congregation. There's a tension here that I can't quite put my finger on, and I have a feeling that you might be able to help me understand what's happening." Her words sent a chill down my spine, because I realized that this experienced woman had somehow detected the undercurrents of deception and corruption that I had been living with for years. I tried to deflect her concerns with generic comments about the usual challenges that any congregation might face. But Sister Hartwell was not easily dismissed. She continued to probe gently but persistently, asking about relationships between the elders, about any unusual situations or problems that might be affecting the spiritual health of our community. Her questions were becoming increasingly specific and pointed, and I began to realize that she suspected something serious was wrong, even if she didn't yet know exactly what it was. The moment of truth came when she asked me directly about my own marriage and my relationship with Thomas. "You seem troubled, dear," she said with genuine concern in her voice. "Is there anything about your situation at home that you need to discuss with someone who might be able to help?" The kindness in her voice and the sincere care in her expression broke down the walls I had built around my terrible secret, and before I could stop myself, I began to tell her everything. I told her about the magazines I had found, about the late-night phone calls and mysterious absences, about the hotel receipt and the intimate letter from Brother Crawford. I described the scene I had witnessed in our driveway, the coded conversations I had observed at Kingdom Hall meetings, and the devastating hypocrisy of watching Thomas counsel other couples about moral purity while living a secret life of sexual deception and betrayal. Sister Hartwell listened to my confession in complete silence, her expression growing more grave and concerned with each revelation I shared. When I finished speaking, she sat quietly for several minutes, apparently processing the magnitude of what I had told her and considering the implications for both our congregation and the broader organization. Finally, she reached across the table and took my hands in hers, speaking with a firmness and authority that commanded my complete attention. "Eleanor," she said, "what you've told me is extremely serious, and it cannot be ignored or covered over for the sake of protecting anyone's reputation. If even half of what you've described is true, then Thomas and Brother Crawford are living in open violation of biblical standards while serving in positions of spiritual authority over God's people. This is exactly the kind of situation that the organization's judicial procedures are designed to address, and it must be brought to the attention of the proper authorities immediately." Her words filled me with both hope and terror. Hope, because finally someone in authority had listened to my story and taken it seriously rather than dismissing it or blaming me for having suspicious thoughts about appointed men. Terror, because I knew that once this process began, there would be no turning back, and the consequences for everyone involved would be devastating and permanent. Sister Hartwell explained that she would need to discuss my allegations with her husband immediately, and that Brother Hartwell would be obligated to conduct a thorough investigation into the conduct of both Thomas and Brother Crawford. She warned me that the process would be difficult and potentially painful, that I would be required to provide detailed testimony about everything I had witnessed and discovered, and that there was a possibility that my marriage and my standing in the congregation might not survive the investigation that was about to begin. But she also assured me that what I had done by speaking up was not only appropriate, but necessary. "A faithful wife has an obligation to protect the spiritual welfare of the congregation," she told me, "even when that means exposing the misconduct of her own husband. Jehovah sees everything, Eleanor, and he uses faithful people like you to cleanse his organization when corruption threatens to contaminate his people." That night, as Thomas slept peacefully beside me, apparently unaware that his carefully constructed double life was about to be exposed, I lay awake, contemplating the enormity of what I had set in motion. Within hours, the circuit overseer would be initiating an investigation that would scrutinize every aspect of Thomas's conduct as an elder and as a husband. The evidence I had gathered over years of suspicious observation would finally be examined by people with the authority to take action. I thought about the young couples Thomas had counseled about marital problems, about the judicial committees he had served on, where he had sat in judgment of others for moral failures far less serious than his own secret sins. I thought about Brother Crawford's wife Martha and their children, about how their lives would be shattered when the truth about their husband and father was finally revealed. Most of all, I thought about the congregation members who had looked up to Thomas as a spiritual example, who had trusted him to guide them in their relationship with Jehovah. The investigation that followed was thorough, methodical, and devastating in its revelations. Brother Hartwell assembled a special committee of elders from neighboring congregations to ensure objectivity and prevent any conflicts of interest. When confronted with the evidence I had provided, both Thomas and Brother Crawford initially attempted to deny the allegations, claiming that their relationship was purely spiritual and that any appearance of impropriety was the result of misunderstanding or malicious interpretation. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming. When the investigating committee searched Thomas's personal belongings with his reluctant permission, they found additional letters, photographs, and other materials that documented a relationship spanning several years and involving multiple partners beyond just Brother Crawford. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and other financial records painted a picture of a secret life, financed partly through misappropriated congregation funds that Thomas had access to as the congregation's account servant. The most damaging evidence came when Brother Hartwell contacted other circuit overseers and asked them to quietly investigate whether similar situations might exist in congregations where Thomas and Brother Crawford had previously served or had frequent contact. What they discovered was a network of compromised elders spanning multiple congregations and circuits, all connected through relationships that violated every principle the Watchtower organization claimed to uphold.